Good evening. This man right here is Elon Musk. And last week, after he purchased Twitter, well, just like that, it looks like the elites of the entire world turned against him. To start with, on April 25th was when Twitter officially accepted Elon Musk's offer of a buyout for $43 billion. And then, wouldn't you know it, just 2 short days later, on April the 27th, through sheer coincidence, the Biden administration's Department of Homeland Security, they announced the formation of something that they called a Disinformation Governance Board in order to fight supposed misinformation. This is the agency that has been colloquially referred to as the Ministry of Truth, which is actually a fairly accurate description of this new agency, given the fact that they are now quite literally in the business of deciding what is and isn't misinformation. Then, just 1 day after this new agency was announced, the United States, alongside the European Union, as well as 32 other countries, they announced something called a Declaration for the Future of the Internet. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is this declaration? I've never heard of such a thing. And that's a great question, because it's frankly not exactly clear, even though I've already read the entire thing. On its face, it's just a 3-page document that broadly, and by broadly I mean very, very broadly, lays out a vision for the future of the internet. Here is, for instance, how this particular document begins. Quote, "We are united by a belief in the potential of digital technologies to promote connectivity, democracy, peace, the rule of law, sustainable development, and the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. But access to the open internet is limited by some authoritarian governments, and online platforms and digital tools are increasingly used to repress freedom of expression and deny other human rights and fundamental freedoms." And so, as you can see from the way that this document is actually worded, it does not mention Twitter by name. But given the timing of this document's release, meaning the fact that it was released just 3 short days after Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, well, it's not outside the realm of possibility to be at least partly related to Twitter's new free speech direction, especially given the fact that it includes segments like these. Quote, "Online platforms have enabled an increase in the spread of illegal or harmful content that can threaten the safety of individuals and contribute to radicalization and violence. Disinformation and foreign malign activity is used to sow division and conflict between individuals or groups in society, undermining respect for and protection of human rights and democratic institutions. We believe we should meet these challenges by working towards a shared vision for the future of the internet that recommits governments and relevant authorities to defending human rights and fostering equitable economic prosperity." And then, in terms of what online platforms like Twitter can actually do in order to enact this declaration in the real world, well, they list it out rather clearly point by point, including this suggestion right here. Quote, "Reaffirm our commitment that actions taken by governments, authorities, and digital services, including online platforms, to reduce illegal and harmful content and activities online be consistent with international human rights law, including the right to freedom of expression while encouraging diversity of opinion and pluralism without fear of censorship, harassment, or intimidation." Now, if this document actually does get enacted, I believe it's not outside the realm of possibility to expect many more disinformation governance boards popping up in countries across the entire world. That's the only way I can actually foresee something like that getting enforced. However, this was not the only swipe that Elon experienced after purchasing Twitter. That's because just earlier this week, 26 different NGOs, with many of them having links to George Soros, well, they signed a letter directed to large advertisers telling them to no longer run ads on Twitter unless they cave to their demands. Here's in fact how their letter begins. Quote, "Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter will further toxify our information ecosystem and be a direct threat to public safety, especially among those already most vulnerable and marginalized." Now, just to pause here for a quick moment, when they say the most marginalized, well, something tells me they are not referring to conservatives, libertarians, or just people who generally question the vast overreach of the government in the last few years. But I digress. The letter continues, quote, "Twitter has outsized influence in shaping both public discourse and industry-wide platform governance standards. While the company is hardly a poster child for healthy social media, it has taken welcome steps in recent years to mitigate systemic risks, ratcheting up pressure on the likes of Facebook and YouTube to follow suit. Musk intends to steamroll those safeguards and provide a megaphone to extremists who traffic in disinformation, hate, and harassment. Under the guise of free speech, his vision will silence and endanger marginalized communities and tear at the fraying fabric of democracy." Now, just to pause here for another quick moment, when I read this, a light bulb went off in my mind, and I realized that in a certain sense, they are right. Because looking back, it actually does seem like all of the big tech censorship that we've experienced over the past, let's say 4 years or so, does seem to originate from Twitter, and then it gets dispersed to the other platforms. Just as one example, Twitter was the first to ban President Trump off their platform, after which all the others seemed to follow suit. Which actually brings us neatly along to the next point that the NGOs actually want to have enacted. That's because this letter, well, it has a very clear call to action to all of Twitter's largest advertisers. Here's what it says, quote, "We call on you, Twitter's top advertisers, to commit to these standards as non-negotiable requirements for advertising on the platform." And then below that, these NGOs go on to list some of their demands, which they say the advertisers should pressure Twitter to enact, which include this, quote, "Keeping accounts, including those of public figures and politicians that were removed for egregious violations of Twitter rules, such as harassment, violence, and hateful conduct, off the platform, and continue to enforce the civic integrity policy along with the hateful conduct policy." Now, of course, the reference to politicians there is a direct nod to people like President Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, as well as Congressman Jim Banks, who was suspended from the platform of Twitter for referring to Dr. Rachel Levine as a man. In case you're not aware, that is an actual reason that people can get kicked off the platform. The letter then continues by urging the advertisers to push Twitter towards more algorithmic accountability, to preserve people's privacy in a more robust way, as well as to commit to being more transparent, and also, quote, "to make sure that you smash that like button and subscribe to the Facts Matter YouTube channel in order to get honest news coverage delivered directly to your newsfeed every single weekday." Now, of course, I'm just kidding about that last point, although, of course, I'm also not kidding, and I do hope that you smash both that like button as well as that subscribe button. Regardless, though, getting back to the actual letter here, after they finish listing all the demands for these large advertisers, the letter rounds itself out and it ends this way, quote, "As top advertisers on Twitter, your brand risks association with a platform amplifying hate, extremism, health misinformation, and conspiracy theorists. Under Musk's management, Twitter risks becoming a cesspool of misinformation with your brand attached, polluting our information ecosystem in a time where trust in institutions and news media is already at an all-time low. Your ad dollars can either fund Musk's vanity project or hold him to account. We call on you to demand Musk uphold these basic standards of community trust and safety and to pull your advertising spending from Twitter if they are not." And then right below that is a list of the signatories of this letter, which includes some organizations that you might have heard of, such as Access Now, Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, Gender Equity Policy Institute, the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, the American chapter of Media Matters. You have NARAL, which is a pro-choice organization here in America. You have the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, Stop Online Violence Against Women Incorporated, the Union of Concerned Scientists, as well as the Women's March. Now, this letter was sent to these big advertisers, such as Coca-Cola, Disney, and Kraft Foods, directly ahead of the 2022 New Front Digital Advertising Conference. It's a fairly big conference, in order to put pressure on them so that they can in turn put pressure on Twitter. And if you recall, this is not the first time that such a campaign has been initiated within the last few years, because back in the year 2020, there was a similar boycott on Facebook, which saw large advertisers like Adidas and Starbucks pulling their ads over what they said, at least, was Facebook's failure to keep hate speech from spreading. And it looks like these organizations are trying once again to pull the same move on Twitter. However, shortly after they sent this letter, Elon Musk fired back by posting this on his own platform, quote, "Who funds these organizations that want to control your access to information? Let's investigate. Sunlight is the best disinfectant." Which, at least in my opinion, was a great question. And the answer, to very few people's surprise, is that based on what we can actually find, because many of these organizations don't actually reveal their donor lists, but based on what we do know, the funding appears to come from an assortment of dark money groups like George Soros' Open Society Foundation. You have NGOs that were founded by former Clinton and Obama administration staffers. You have wealthy Democrat donors and their family foundations. You have labor unions and the governments of European nations. In fact, Fox Business did a deep dive analysis, and they explained the details surrounding the funding of those organizations this way, quote, "Many of the groups that signed the letter have been financially backed by George Soros' Open Society Foundations and teachers' unions, including the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, and the National Education Association, the NEA. NARAL Pro-Choice America, a pro-abortion nonprofit, is backed in part by the AFT and the Service Employees International Union, otherwise known as the CEIU, according to Influence Watch. The Women's March, a feminist group, is funded in part by AFT and the Soros-backed Move On. The group's Free Press and Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, which also signed the letter, are funded, at least in part, by Soros's Open Society Institute. Multiple European governments are also major donors to one of the letter's signatories. Access Now, which discloses its funding online, is backed in part by the Swedish government's developmental agency, otherwise known as SIDA, the governments of Canada, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as Soros's Open Society foundations. Now, it is worth mentioning that outside of this pressure campaign, the 91-year-old George Soros's grip on the media is fairly extensive and well documented. In fact, there was a phenomenal book by Mr. Matthew Palumbo. It was called The Man Behind the Curtain, Inside the Secret Network of George Soros, and in it, Matthew exposed how many of America's publications, as well as American news corporations in general, are represented by journalists that serve on Soros-funded boards, including many household names such as the New York Times, the Seattle Times, the LA Times, the Baltimore Sun, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fortune Magazine, ABC, USA Today, the Washington Post, NPR, CBS, Huffington Post, the New Yorker, the Sacramento Bee, the Houston Chronicle, Associated Press, and many, many more publications that reported critically on Musk's Twitter takeover. Which also, of course, comes hand in hand with the fact that only 7% of reporters identify as being Republicans, and also the fact that 90% of the political donations that came out of big tech in the last election cycle went to Democrats. Which, again, just adds to the irony of all these organizations pushing for more and more representation and more equity without ever making a push for more diversity of thought. Regardless, though, if you'd like to read either this letter by the 26 NGOs, this declaration for the future of the internet, or if you'd like to check out that book about George Soros' control of the media, I'll throw all that down into the description box below. And all I ask in return is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, all I ask in return is that you take a quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm.